She first noticed the changes in her husband on a Tuesday evening in late September. The summer heat had finally broken, and she opened all the windows in their little two-bedroom house to let the cool air sweep through. They'd been married for 6 years, not so long that they took each other for granted, but long enough that she knew his habits, his moods, the way his forehead creased when he was worried about money. That evening, he came home later than usual. She was chopping vegetables for dinner when she heard his key in a lock. "You're late," she called from the kitchen, not accusingly, just stating a fact. They told each other about their days. It was their little ritual. "Yeah, sorry about that." He appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, looking somehow different. Not tired, exactly. More awake. "Tom from accounting invited me to his church after work. I figured why not, you know." She raised an eyebrow, the knife pausing mid-chop. In 6 years of marriage, her husband had shown exactly zero interest in religion. His parents had dragged him to services as a kid, and it had put him off the whole thing. "Tom's church? That new one on the edge of town?" She resumed chopping. "What's it called again?" "Luminous Path Fellowship." He said the words carefully, like they were made of glass. "It's not what I expected." "What do you mean?" She scraped the vegetables into a pan. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, which was unusual. Normally he'd go change his clothes first. It wasn't boring, for one thing. Not like church when I was a kid. His eyes had a strange brightness to them. The pastor there, he doesn't just talk about ancient stories and rules. He talks about finding your purpose, about how we're all connected, about reaching your highest potential. She stirred the vegetables, listening. Her husband worked as an accountant at a firm that didn't appreciate him. For 3 years, he'd been passed over for promotion. Lately, he'd seemed stuck, going through the motions. "That sounds nice," she said carefully. It was more than nice. He leaned forward. "You know how sometimes you hear something and it just clicks? Like it's what you've been waiting to hear your whole life but didn't know it." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood. "When Pastor Raymond spoke, it felt like he was talking directly to me." He tapped his chest, "like he could see things in me that I couldn't see in myself." She put down her wooden spoon and really looked at him. There was color in his cheeks, and his eyes had a spark she hadn't seen in months, maybe years. "I'm glad you had a good time," she said, meaning it. Anything that made him look this alive couldn't be bad, right? Over dinner, he talked more about the church service. The music, the friendly people, the way Pastor Raymond moved around the stage, like he was dancing with his ideas. He barely touched his food, which wasn't like him at all. "Maybe I'll come with you next time," she suggested, collecting their plates. His was still half full. Something flickered across his face, hesitation, before he smiled. "Yeah, maybe. Though Pastor Raymond says sometimes people need to find their own path first before bringing others along." She nodded, but something small and cold settled in her stomach. They always did things together. That was their way. That night in bed, he read something on his phone instead of watching their usual show. When she asked what he was reading, he said, "Just some materials Pastor Raymond sent. About preparing your mind for greater awareness." She rolled over, trying to ignore the odd feeling in her chest. Change was good, right? Her husband seemed happier, more engaged. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake a strange feeling, like the man lying next to her, the one whose breathing she could recognize in a crowd, had somehow become slightly unfamiliar. As if someone had shifted all the furniture in their house just an inch to the left. Everything looked the same, but something was off. "It's just a church," she told herself as sleep pulled her under. What harm could possibly come from a church? She didn't know then how much she would come to regret that thought. How one invitation on a Tuesday evening would slowly unravel everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her husband, and the invisible lines that both connect and separate two people who share a life. 3 weeks passed, and her husband didn't miss a single service at the Luminous Path Fellowship. What started as Sunday mornings quickly expanded to Wednesday evening study groups and Saturday morning community outreach. She tried not to mind. After all, he seemed happier, more energetic, even if that energy was now directed somewhere else. It was the small changes she noticed first. One morning, she picked up his phone to check the weather while hers was charging. The screen flashed. "Enter passcode." She frowned. They'd never locked their phones from each other before. It wasn't a jealousy thing, it was just practical. Sometimes she needed to make a call when her battery died, or he needed to check an email while his phone updated. Hey, she called to him in the bathroom, where the shower was running. Since when do you have a passcode on your phone? The water shut off abruptly. He poked his head around the door, water dripping from his hair. Of that, Pastor Raymond suggested it during Sunday's sermon on digital boundaries. He says our devices are extensions of our inner thoughts, and we should protect them like we protect our minds. She set the phone down. So, your inner thoughts need protection from me now? He gave a little laugh that didn't sound quite right. Don't be silly. It's just a good habit, that's all. He disappeared back into the bathroom. She stood there in their bedroom, feeling silly indeed, but not for the reasons he meant. The next change was harder to ignore. He started waking up at 5 a.m. every day, his alarm vibrating softly under his pillow. The first time it happened, she rolled over confused. "What's wrong?" she mumbled. "Did you forget something for work?" "Nothing's wrong," he whispered, already pulling on sweatpants. "I'm just doing the morning meditation practice Pastor Raymond recommended. Go back to sleep." She watched through half-closed eyes as he left their bedroom. From the living room came the soft sounds of him settling on the floor, then silence. When she woke again at 7, he was showered and dressed, making coffee with a serene expression she didn't recognize. "How was meditation?" she asked, reaching for a mug. "Transformative," he replied, using a word she'd never heard him say before. "Pastor Raymond says early morning is when the veil between realms is thinnest." She nodded like this made perfect sense and took her coffee to the shower. Their weekend traditions disappeared next. For years, they'd spent Saturday mornings at the corner cafe, sharing sections of the newspaper and arguing playfully about whether the crossword was better tackled with pen or pencil. Now, Saturdays belonged to the church's community service projects. Sundays had always been for lazy brunches at home. She'd cook something special, maybe pancakes with fresh berries, or an omelette with the good cheese, and they'd eat late, still in pajamas, planning their week between bites. Now he was up and out the door before she woke, returning in the afternoon with a strange, glassy look that took hours to fade. "Why don't I come with you on Sunday?" she suggested over dinner one night. "I'd like to see what's got you so excited." He looked up from his plate, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. Something flickered across his face, alarm, concern, before settling into a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you'd enjoy it," he said carefully. "It's not for everyone. You have to be ready." "Ready for what?" "For the teachings. For the truth." He took a bite of food, chewing thoughtfully. "Pastor Raymond says some people need more preparation before they can truly hear the message." "And you think I'm one of those people?" She tried to keep her voice light, but something cold settled in her stomach. "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone finds their path when they're meant to." That night in bed, she reached for him like she always did, her hand seeking his across the sheets. He took it, but his grip was limp, distracted. The inches between their bodies felt like miles. "Is everything okay?" she whispered into the darkness. "With us, I mean." "Of course," he answered, too quickly. "I'm just processing a lot from today's teaching." She lay awake long after his breathing had deepened into sleep, staring at the ceiling. The man beside her used the same shampoo, wore the same faded t-shirt to bed, snored in the same familiar pattern. But somehow he wasn't the same person who had come home with her from their honeymoon. That man had looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had. This man looked past her, toward something she couldn't see. And for the first time in their marriage, she felt truly cold, even with the summer heat pressing against their windows and his body just inches from hers. The credit card bill arrived on a Thursday. She usually paid the bills, not because he couldn't, but because she was better at keeping track of due dates. They'd set up this system years ago, back when they were just starting out and every dollar mattered. She sat at the kitchen table, opening envelopes while drinking her morning coffee. The credit card statement was thicker than usual. She flipped through the pages, scanning the charges, when her eyes caught on something that made her coffee turn cold in her stomach. Luminous Path Fellowship, $750. Luminous Path Books and Media, $320. Luminous Path Special Offering, $1,900. Almost $3,000 in 1 month. She checked the date on the statement again, thinking there must be some mistake. But no, these were recent charges. She looked at the figure again, $1,900 for a special offering. That was more than their monthly mortgage payment. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the paper. This wasn't just concerning, it was terrifying. They'd been saving for years, putting aside whatever they could manage after bills were paid, dreaming of a house with a bigger yard, maybe a baby someday. And now, thousands of dollars gone without a word to her. She heard his key in the door. He was home early from work, which never happened anymore. She looked up as he walked into the kitchen, his face lighting up when he saw her, then dimming when he noticed the papers spread on the table. "You're home early," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Pastor Raymond gave a special afternoon blessing for church members. I didn't want to miss it." He set down his keys. "What are you looking at?" She held up the credit card statement, her finger pointing to the charges. "Can you explain this?" He walked over and glanced at the paper, his expression changing from confusion to something else, something calm and distant that scared her more than anger would have. "Those are my donations to the church," he said simply. $3,000, without talking to me first? Her voice rose slightly. "That's our savings, money we've been putting aside for years, for our future." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, folding his hands on the table like he was about to explain something simple to a child. "Material possessions don't matter in the grand scheme," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Pastor Raymond has shown me that what we think of as savings are just golden handcuffs tying us to a materialistic world." She stared at him, not recognizing the person sitting across from her. "Golden handcuffs? Since when do you talk like this? That money was for our future home, maybe even a family someday." "Physical homes crumble," he replied, as if reciting something memorized. "The only true home is spiritual. Pastor Raymond says sacrifice is the path to clarity." "Pastor Raymond," she repeated, feeling something crack inside her. "Pastor Raymond gets $3,000 of our money, and what do you get? Some vague promise of spiritual clarity." His face hardened. "You wouldn't understand. You haven't been shown what I've been shown." "Then show me," she challenged, pushing the statement toward him. "Explain to me how giving away our savings without even talking to me is part of any legitimate spiritual path." "Pastor Raymond says doubt is the enemy of growth." His voice had taken on that mechanical quality she'd come to dread. "He warned me that loved ones might try to block my journey." "Block your journey?" She felt like she'd been slapped. "I've supported everything you've done. I just want to understand why our shared money is suddenly going to this man we barely know." "Pastor Raymond isn't just some man," he said, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. "He's a spiritual guide who's shown me truths I never knew existed." "Like what? What truths justify taking our savings without even mentioning it to me?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand what I've been shown," he whispered, his voice suddenly cold. "Maybe you never will." Before she could respond, he grabbed his keys and walked out, leaving her alone at the kitchen table with the statement still in her hands. She listened to his car start, back out of the driveway, and disappear down the street. The house felt suddenly too big, too empty. She looked around at the home they'd built together, the photos on the walls, the one couch where they'd spent countless evenings watching movies, the small dining table where they'd shared thousands of meals. All the physical evidence of their life together seemed to mock her now. For the first time, she let herself consider a terrifying thought. What if I'm losing him? Not to another woman or to some midlife crisis, but to something more powerful, something that had reshaped his mind so completely that the man she married was disappearing before her eyes. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then called her sister. "I need help," she said when her sister answered. "I think my husband has joined a cult." Her sister listened without interrupting as she explained everything. The sudden interest in the church, the behavior changes, the money. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Have you looked into this church?" her sister finally asked. "I mean, really looked into it." She hadn't. Somehow it felt like an invasion of privacy. But now, with $3,000 gone and her husband becoming a stranger, privacy seemed less important than answers. After they hung up, she opened her laptop. She typed Luminous Path Fellowship into the search bar and hit enter. The church's official website appeared first, sleek and professional, with lots of vague talk about personal evolution and spiritual awakening. Photos showed smiling people in a modern building with blue lighting. Pastor Raymond featured prominently, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of smile that seemed practiced for cameras. She scrolled past the official site and found something more interesting, a forum called Cult Watch. Her finger hesitated over the mouse pad before clicking. The forum had an entire section dedicated to the Luminous Path Fellowship. Her heart sank as she read post after post from people sharing stories disturbingly similar to hers. My brother joined 6 months ago. Now he barely speaks to family. My wife donated our entire savings. When I questioned it, she moved out. They isolate members gradually. First it's just extra church activities, then suddenly your loved one only associates with church people. She read for hours, her coffee going cold beside her. According to former members, the pattern was always the same: gradual isolation from family and friends, increasing financial contributions, and a growing devotion to Pastor Raymond that bordered on worship. One post caught her eye. Has anyone noticed how many professionals Raymond targets? Doctors, lawyers, accountants, people with money and respectability. Her husband was an accountant. She clicked on the profile of the person who wrote that post, someone using the username EscapeThePath. The profile said they'd left the church after 2 years and were now helping others get out. She hesitated, then sent a private message explaining her situation. While waiting for a reply, she dug deeper into Pastor Raymond's background. It wasn't easy. The church's website offered only a carefully crafted biography. But public records told a different story. Before founding the Luminous Path Fellowship 3 years ago, Raymond Mercer had run similar churches under different names in 3 other states. Each time, he'd left amid accusations of financial impropriety, though he'd never been formally charged. In one news article from a small-town paper, a former member claimed Raymond had convinced her to sign over her late husband's life insurance policy, nearly $200,000, to the church. By the time she realized her mistake, the money was gone. Her phone pinged with a notification. EscapeThePath had replied, "What you're describing is textbook LPF. They're skilled at this. Would you be willing to talk by phone? It's easier to explain that way." The message included a phone number. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed. "Hello." A man's voice answered, sounding cautious. "Hi, this is, well, I messaged you about my husband and the Luminous Path Fellowship." "Right." His voice softened. "I'm sorry you're going through this. I know how it feels." "How did you get out?" she asked, clutching the phone. "It wasn't easy." He paused. "My name's Theo, by the way. I was in for 2 years. My wife was the one who never gave up on me, kept trying to reach the real me under all the programming." "Programming?" The word sent a chill through her. "That's what it is," Theo said firmly. "They use sleep deprivation, isolation, repetitive phrases, classic mind control techniques. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd given them nearly $50,000 and almost lost my marriage." Her throat tightened. "How did your wife get through to you?" She connected with other families going through the same thing, formed a support group, gathered evidence about Raymond's past scams. He paused. "Look, there's a coffee shop downtown, Corner Brew. I meet there with others who've been affected by LPF. We're gathering tomorrow at 2. Why don't you join us?" She glanced at the clock. Her husband would be at a church event until late. "I'll be there." After hanging up, she stared at her research notes, feeling both terrified and strangely relieved. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't overreacting. What was happening had happened to others, which meant there might be a way to undo it. She looked at their wedding photo on the desk, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke, eyes bright with hope for their future. "I'm going to fight for you," she whispered to his smiling image. "Even if you don't know you need saving yet." The Corner Brew coffee shop was busy when she arrived. She hesitated at the door, scanning the room until she spotted a table in the back corner with 4 people sitting quietly, none of them talking much. Somehow, she knew this was them. Theo noticed her and waved her over. She recognized him from his profile picture, mid-40s, kind eyes, the tired look of someone who'd been through something difficult and survived. "Glad you made it," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "This is Lily, Raj, and Beth. Their spouses are all involved with the Luminous Path." They nodded at her with understanding looks that made her throat tight. These strangers knew exactly what she was going through. "I wasn't sure about coming," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug Theo pushed toward her. "It feels like I'm going behind my husband's back." "We all felt that way at first," said Lily, a woman with gray-streaked hair. "My husband was involved for almost a year before I found help. I kept thinking he'd snap out of it on his own." "Did he?" she asked, hope rising. Lily nodded. "Eventually, but it wasn't easy and it wasn't quick." For the next hour, they shared stories that made her skin crawl with recognition. The patterns were identical: sudden fascination with Pastor Raymond's teachings, withdrawal from family and friends, secret donations, strange new vocabulary. "The thing that helped me understand what was happening," Raj said, "was attending a service myself, seeing it firsthand." She blinked. "You can just go." "The Sunday services are open to the public," Theo explained. "It's the private sessions afterward that are members only." But even just seeing the main service was eye-opening for me. She thought about it. Her husband would be shocked if he saw her there, but maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe seeing her, they would break through whatever wall had been built between them. "I'll go this Sunday," she decided. Sunday arrived with knots in her stomach. Her husband had left early, as usual. She dressed carefully. Nothing that would stand out, just a simple blouse and pants. The church building was modern, all glass and steel, with a sign that read Luminous Path Fellowship. Discovered your true potential. She slipped into the back row just as the service was starting. Music played, not traditional hymns, but something more like what you'd hear at a high-end spa or wellness retreat. Soft lighting changed colors gradually, shifting from blue to purple to pink. Then Pastor Raymond appeared on stage, and she finally understood part of his appeal. He moved with the confident grace of a performer, his voice rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Even knowing what she now knew about him, she found herself lean forward, drawn in by his charisma. "We are not meant to live small lives," he told the rapt audience. "We are not meant to be bound by society's expectations, by family obligations that hold us back from our true purpose." She felt a chill. No wonder her husband was pulling away from their marriage. Pastor Raymond was explicitly telling him to. The pastor continued, weaving together bits of science, spirituality, and doomsday warnings. "The world as we know it is changing. Those who aren't prepared will be left behind. Those who haven't awakened will suffer." Her eyes found her husband in the crowd, sitting near the front. He was nodding eagerly at everything Pastor Raymond said, completely absorbed. She barely recognized him. The sharp, logical accountant who used to make fun of self-help gurus was gone, replaced by someone who accepted wild claims without question. After the main service, she watched as certain members, including her husband, were led through a side door. An enthusiastic young woman with a clipboard stood guard. "Excuse me," she approached the woman. "What's happening in there?" The woman smiled brightly. "That's our deeper teaching session." "Are you here?" "Yes, first time." She tried to peek through the door. "My husband went in." "Oh, how wonderful. But those sessions are by invitation only." The woman's smile never wavered. "Pastor Raymond personally selects those who are ready for advanced teachings." "Ready? What does that mean?" "Spiritually prepared." The woman lowered her voice. "Not everyone can handle the truth Pastor Raymond shares. Some minds aren't evolved enough yet. But don't worry. Keep attending the regular services, and if you're meant to receive the deeper wisdom, you will." She nodded as if this made perfect sense and wandered back to the main hall, which was emptying out. Her mind raced. What happened in those deeper teaching sessions? What was Pastor Raymond telling his select followers behind closed doors? On the drive home, she gripped the steering wheel tightly. The deeper teachings explained so much: why her husband seemed to have two different personalities now. One for the outside world and another for fellow church members. She pulled into their driveway and sat in the car, gathering her thoughts. She'd seen enough. The next step was clear, but it would be the hardest yet. She would have to find a way into one of those private sessions to see exactly what kind of hold Pastor Raymond had over her husband. She was washing dishes when she heard the front door open. 3 months had passed since her husband started attending the Luminous Path Fellowship, and she'd grown used to his unpredictable schedule. What she wasn't prepared for was what she saw when she walked into the living room. Her husband standing there with a suitcase. Her heart stopped. What's going on? He set the suitcase down, not quite meeting her eyes. Pastor Raymond has invited select members to a special retreat facility in the mountains. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. 2 weeks? The dish towel dropped from her hands. You can't just disappear for 2 weeks. What about work? What about us? I've already arranged time off, he said flatly. As for us, this is important for my spiritual development. She stared at the suitcase. 2 weeks at some remote location with Pastor Raymond and his inner circle. Everything she'd learned from Theo and the others flashed through her mind, how these retreats were where the most intensive programming happened. I don't think you should go, she said carefully. His face hardened. I wasn't asking permission. I know, but she took a deep breath. I'm worried about you, about what's happening to you. Nothing's happening to me, he snapped. I'm finally waking up, finally seeing clearly. Seeing what clearly? That giving away our money to some guy with a fancy website is a good idea. That ignoring your family and friends is somehow spiritual. His eyes narrowed. This is exactly what Pastor Raymond warned about. Negativity from loved ones who aren't evolved enough to understand the path. Evolved enough? She couldn't keep the frustration from her voice. Do you even hear yourself? You used to make fun of people who talked like this. Maybe I was spiritually stunted then, he shot back. Too closed-minded to see the truth. The truth? She stepped closer. I looked into your Pastor Raymond. Did you know he's run 3 churches in 3 different states? Did you know he left each one after accusations of financial fraud? Did you know? Stop, he shouted, his face flushing. You've been investigating him, going behind my back? Someone had to. You're not the person I married anymore. You're letting this man control your thoughts, your words. He's not controlling anything. He's guiding me toward my true self. His voice grew louder with each word. Your true self wouldn't abandon our plans, our future. She gestured around their home. We built this life together. We had dreams. Material dreams, he dismissed with a wave of his hand. Shallow accomplishments that mean nothing in the grand spiritual journey. She felt something crucial slipping away, like sand through her fingers. Please, she whispered, just skip this retreat. Stay home. Let's talk about this. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a glimpse of his old self, but it vanished quickly. I'm going, he said firmly. I need to go. If you go to this retreat, she said quietly, things might not be the same when you get back. A strange, calm expression settled over his face. Pastor Raymond says that sometimes we need to leave people behind if they resist the path, even loved ones. The words hit her like a physical blow. Are you saying you'd leave me? Over this church? He picked up his suitcase, still not meeting her eyes. I'm saying I need to follow my spiritual journey wherever it leads, if you can't support that. He let the sentence hang unfinished between them. She watched him walk to the door, frozen in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not to them. Not to the man who had once surprised her with breakfast in bed on random Tuesdays, who had held her through her father's long illness, who had built a life with her piece by piece. When does the retreat end? She asked, her voice small. 2 weeks from today, he answered, his hand on the doorknob. I'll call when I can. After he left, she sat on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing. Their wedding photo looked down from the wall, 2 smiling people who no longer existed in the same way. Her phone rang, startling her. It was Theo. I just wanted to check in, he said. How are things? He's gone to a mountain retreat with Pastor Raymond, she said, her voice breaking. For 2 weeks, he said. He said Pastor Raymond told him he might need to leave me behind. There was a long silence on the other end. The mountain retreat, Theo finally said, his voice grim. That's where they separate the true believers from everyone else. My wife called it their point-of-no-return program. What do I do? She whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I'm losing him. Listen carefully, Theo said. We don't have much time. Call everyone who ever mattered to your husband. Parents, siblings, friends. We need to gather evidence, testimonies. We need to be ready when he comes back. Ready for what? For the hardest conversation of your life, Thea replied. For an intervention that might be your only chance to get your husband back. Armed with stories from people who left the church, money records showing Pastor Raymond's fancy life, and proof of how the church messed with people's minds, she put together a plan. Her husband's old friend from college helped her gather his parents, his best buddy from work, and someone who knew how to help people leave cults. When he came back from that mountain retreat, he looked skinnier, with dark circles under his eyes. His face seemed empty somehow, like someone had taken out the spark that made him who he was. He walked through the front door, dropped his bag, and froze when he saw everyone waiting in the living room. "What's this?" he asked, his voice flat. "We need to talk," she said, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "We're worried about you." The first day was awful, he yelled. He tried to leave. He said they were all against his spiritual growth. He quoted Pastor Raymond so much it was like the man was there in the room with them. My husband is still in there, she thought, watching him pace and argue. I just need to find him. On the second day, things got worse before they got better. He refused to eat. He sat in silence for hours. But then his dad started talking about fishing trips they used to take, and something flickered in his eyes, just for a second, but it was there. The expert they brought in was gentle but firm. The church uses sleep deprivation, she explained. They make you doubt your memories. They tell you that questions mean weakness. By the third day, cracks started showing in the wall the church had built around his mind. His mom brought photo albums, pictures of him as a little boy building sandcastles, as a teenager with his first car, in college with messy hair and bright eyes. "Remember who you were," his mom said, voice breaking. "Before all this." He stared at a photo of himself laughing at their wedding. His finger traced her face in the picture. "I thought I was finding answers," he finally said, and his voice sounded like his own again, not the hollow church voice he'd been using. "I was so stressed about work, about money. Pastor Raymond made everything sound simple, clear." He looked up, tears in his eyes. "But then they started telling me who to love, how to think. They said you were holding me back." He broke down then, really broke down. His body shook with sobs as the programming cracked and fell away. Getting better wasn't quick or easy. Some nights she'd wake up and find his side of the bed empty. She'd find him in the kitchen, staring at nothing, struggling with doubts. The church had planted deep roots in his mind, and pulling them out hurt. They started seeing a marriage counselor. At first, they could barely look at each other during sessions. There was too much pain, too much betrayal on both sides. He felt ashamed. She felt afraid it could happen again. Trust is easy to break and hard to rebuild. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," he told her one night, 6 weeks after the intervention. They were sitting on the porch steps, watching fireflies blink in the yard. "Maybe start by forgiving yourself for being human," she said. "We all want to believe in something bigger than ourselves." Slowly, day by day, they found their way back to each other. Not to what they had been, that was gone, but to something new, something that acknowledged the broken places but didn't live in them. 6 months later, they were driving past the church building when they noticed workers taking down the sign. A small newspaper article revealed that Pastor Raymond had fled town after financial fraud accusations. "Stop the car," he said suddenly. She pulled over, worried about what seeing the church might trigger in him. He got out, walked a few steps, and just stood there looking at the building. "You okay?" she asked, coming up beside him. "I think I am," he said, surprising himself. He reached for her hand without looking away from the empty church. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything." She squeezed his hand, feeling something settle between them. The church had nearly destroyed their marriage, but in rebuilding it, they'd created something stronger. As they walked back to the car together, she realized that's how healing works, not by going back to what was, but by building something new from the broken pieces.